If you are a beginner and you're starting out in watercolor painting, this tutorial is for you. I'm Karen Rice and I've been teaching adults watercolor painting for over 30 years. So I've really learnt along the way the best sort of exercises and tips and tricks to help adults learn watercolor without them feeling foolish and not giving up. And hopefully this tutorial will give you confidence. What I do is I put together 6 of my one color tutorials. And I take you through sort of the basic techniques, basic materials, and I gradually sort of add a little bit more techniques, more materials, and you will start to get that learning curve of starting out as a beginner, and then gradually I push you just a little bit, and hopefully you gain confidence to paint the little bit more complicated tutorials towards the end of this tutorial. So I really hope you find this video helpful. Let's get started. This first tutorial I use ultramarine blue, and I actually go through the do's and don'ts of watercolors, and I show you all the basic techniques, what to do and what not to do. There is no drawing involved and you'll just jump in and have a go, and I would encourage you to have a go at what not to do as well. You'll learn so much from that. Let's take a look. I'm using ultramarine blue. For a full list of all the materials I'm using, please see the description below. This is framing tape. You can use masking tape. I'm using a scissors and I'm going to cut out a small triangle and stick it on to the watercolor paper, which is a cold press paper, 300 grams. And I'm sticking the little triangles below the halfway line on each of my paintings. And what the framing tape will do, it will mask out that white area there, and it will look, when you peel it off later, like 2 little white sails, and it's a great alternative to masking fluid, and you can use masking tape as well. I'm using a size 6 brush, and I'm actually going to paint the don'ts painting first. I've been teaching watercolor classes for quite a few years. One of the mistakes a beginner makes, and they don't know because they're learning watercolor, so that's understandable. They don't make enough wash to begin with, and I've just made a little bit of a wash, and they always tend to use a small brush because they're afraid to use a larger brush because they may feel they're going to lose control using larger washes. Thing with a small brush, it doesn't carry very much paint, so you have to keep getting fresh paint and you keep running out of paint. So as you can see here, I'm trying to smooth in, and a lot of my students tend to try and fill in, and they go back and forth like you would with household decorating, and it's a completely different technique to that. And they'll keep sort of getting paint, keep going back for more. As you can see here, I'm getting all that sort of dry brush effect, and if you look at the top there, I've got little white speckles coming through. And then what they tend to do is make more paint, but it's not kind of the same colour. It's slightly darker in tone, or maybe too pale, and then they'll worry about those little white specks and they'll cover those up with some of the dark paint, but the paint might be too wet going into a drying paint. And then they'll sort of get more water. They'll put water on there to try and blend things. And what happens when you put that water on there, that's very watery. And the paint on the paper, it isn't as watery, it's drying off. And then they'll try and blend the top bit. And just to let you into a secret, when I first started in watercolour painting, this is exactly what I did. When I did my art degree, I was never shown how to use watercolours. I used to use acrylic paint. So it's all very new to me. But I really wanted to learn watercolour. I really want to show you what I've learnt in my journey. So as you can see here, when you add very wet paint to drying paint, you lose control. And what I'd like to show you here on the left hand side is how to maintain that control. So the first most important thing is to mix up plenty of paint, especially if you're working in a large area, and use a medium-sized brush. I'm also putting my paper now on a tilt, and this is to allow me to see a watercolor bead. So I'm using a large brush and I've fully loaded that brush. It's really important to dip your brush right into that paint and start painting with a loaded brush, gliding your brush gently across the paper. Can you see that bead there I'm pointing to? You kind of want to see that when you're painting. This way you maintain control and you get a lovely even wash. None of that streaking that I've got on the right hand side. As you can see, I fully load my brush and go over that bead 50-50. So my brush is slightly above it and below it. And I glide that paint across that, not pressing too hard. So otherwise sometimes when you press hard you can get streaking as well. fully load that brush and glide it effortlessly, hopefully, across the other side. And you can see why it's so important to have lots and lots of paint and to have your painting on the tilt so you can see that bead. It allows the paint to run down so you can control it. Even though you're using lots of paint, you feel like you're not going to have the control. So I've added water to that wash now to lighten it so it gets paler as it goes towards the horizon, but the consistency is the same. I'm doing the same technique, taking my time. So it's all about preparation, having that tilt, large brush, and gliding that brush gently. Sometimes I'll start from the left and sometimes I'll start from the right, depending on what that bead is doing, and I'll wait for the bead as well, wait for that paint to run down. If you aren't getting a bead, maybe tilt your painting a little bit more. You want about a 20-degree angle. And if you're still not getting the bead, try loading your brush more and waiting. And I'm just using clean water now to go towards the bottom of the painting and really sort of gliding my brush so I don't have any paint at the bottom. So I'll rinse my brush, take the excess off on the paper towel and just collect any residue paint at the bottom so it doesn't leak later up into my painting to cause a back run. I think it's a good idea now to allow both paintings to dry. So what I'm doing now is I'm putting some framing tape across the sort of sea and sky there, pressing down the bottom part of the tape, peeling away the top part. So I've only got the bottom part stuck to the paper, and this is to give me a horizon line. So I'm going to work on the don'ts again first of all. I'm trying to get a dry brush effect, so I'm working wet on dry with the ultramarine, but I've not really done any preparation. I'm putting watery paint on, then thicker ultramarine, lots of water. So you've always got to have a plan ahead with what you're going to do, otherwise you just get lost in your painting. And I haven't really painted up to the tape, so the horizon line won't be there when I peel the tape off. So here's the planning stage. This is what I recommend you do. I'm painting on the horizon area first. I've sort of loaded my brush with a medium tone paint. You can take the excess paint off with a paper towel using this size 6 brush just to give myself a little bit of control because I'm painting the sea in sections. So horizon first with a light to medium tone. I want it to show up against the horizon. I'm also using a dry brush effect so you can get that lovely sparkle light on the water. So don't use a very heavily loaded brush. Maybe wipe your brush, the excess paint, on a paper towel as well to give that effect. So I'm using a mid to dark tone here, slightly darker in the middle of the water, adding a little bit more ultramarine so it's slightly creamier paint, still working wet on dry, using the belly of the brush sometimes as well to create that lovely sparkle there, and using the tip of the brush to create some movement in the water. But what I'm really trying to get across here is the planning of this, sort of working back to front, making sure I've got my horizon, bigger marks in the foreground, darker in the foreground, rather than getting lost, and maybe a little bit of marks just beneath the sailboat. And now I'm going to allow my paintings to dry. Once your painting is dry, you can remove your framing tape very gently so you don't tear the paper. Make sure it's dry. One thing you'll notice is that I don't have a horizon line on that right hand side painting, but the tape has come off quite nicely on the white sails there. So I'm painting the don'ts painting, and I've just mixed up a little bit of ultramarine, and instead of leaving a little bit of white there, I've just painted straight over the top. I find a lot of beginners do this. They sort of forget. So the white is very important to keep that light. So here on the do's painting, I'm painting on the left hand side, wet on dry with some ultramarine, rinsing my brush, taking the excess off, and blending that sort of pale ultramarine paint into the white side, keeping that light. And if you lose it, lift it off with some paper towel. I'm just painting a little bit of dark ultramarine under each of the sailboats there, and I'm going to allow my paintings to dry once again. So I'm using a lifting off method to show the light reflections in the water. I know it's not there in the photograph, but I'm using a flat synthetic brush, but I'm using too much water and losing control, and the reflection gets bigger. So if you want the control, use the same brush, take the excess water off on a paper towel, Line up where the sail is, you get it directly beneath, because it's almost like it's like a mirrored reflection, and just work very gently, lifting off here and there. So I'm just sort of lifting off smaller sections, getting that control, not committing myself too much, really looking at the shape there. So it's wider as it's the top of the reflection there. As it comes away, it's thinner, and it's like a mirrored reflection there, and it's quite effective. And I'm also going to lift off some light sort of waves as well, here and there around the reflection area, just a little bit of artistic license. Always keep cleaning your brush as well, so the water's really clean, lifting off until you're happy with the light that you've created. The paper's still stained. You don't want it too white. You just want that impression of the reflection of the sail in the water there, and keep lifting off the excess paint on the paper with your paper towel. So you saw that I was taking my time there, lifting off. Again, I'm using too much water on the don'ts painting. So it's all about control. So less is more. Planning really will give you more time and hopefully more confidence as well. So here are the two finished paintings. I've removed the framing tape to reveal a really nice white border as well. It's a nice way of presenting your work. So I really hope you found that tutorial helpful, and it's a good idea maybe to use another colour and just keep practicing and see what happens. Remember, keep practicing what not to do as well. So for this next tutorial, I use one colour again, of course, and I take you through what I always used to teach my watercolour beginners, a simple landscape scene straight out of my imagination. And I take you through sort of step-by-step, simple sort of landscape techniques in watercolour that will get you hopefully building confidence, and it will allow you to practice. And again, I encourage you to use different colours, different dark colours, to practice these techniques. So let's take a look. So I'm just going to draw a simple sketch, just a horizon line here about a third of the way down from the top. Some trees here. I'm using an HB pencil on rough 300 grams watercolour paper, a few grasses in the foreground as well. I'm going to use Payne's grey. You can use black or any dark colour, and that's the solution. It's just to take away the issue of colour, the problem of colour, and just get used to using watercolour. And this is a great exercise for beginners. So I'm mixing up 2 washes here with my size 10 round brush, a light and a medium wash. Always mix up plenty of paint. That way you don't have to start mixing while you're in the middle of painting a wash. So I am wetting the watercolour paper with a large brush all over. Take your time doing this. Let the water soak in. It gives you longer to paint. And what I'm doing now is I'm painting the light wash first. In watercolour, we work light to dark. So I'm painting this from the sky to the middle distance right down to the foreground. And now I'm using the mid-tone and painting the sort of top and the middle of the sky. So it's slightly darker at the top, and it gets lighter as it goes towards the horizon. And I'm painting the reflection of the trees now, wet into wet, with my size 10 round brush, just with that mid-tone wash. So as you can see there, I'm just creating the illusion of the reflection of the trees, painting a few ripples in the water. And just to say, this painting is from my imagination. I usually use this one as a sort of first painting for beginners when they join my class, and it just takes all the pressure off and they really love doing it. So I have swapped to a smaller brush. It's a size 6 round to make and paint smaller marks using that mid-tone. If you notice, the sky is darker at the top, lighter at the horizon area, and that creates depth in your painting. So what's nearer to you is stronger in tonal value. So I'm just adding a few more sort of marks here with the reflection, wet into wet. Now I'm mixing up some thicker paint here, less water, more paint, and I'm painting the trees damp into damp, so the surface isn't as wet and the paint isn't as wet. And you might want to take off the excess paint on a paper towel to help you as well with this technique. So I'm going to allow my painting to dry thoroughly. And what I'm doing now to get a straight horizon, a water's edge here, I'm using some framing tape. You can use masking tape, and I'm sticking it to the dry surface just at the top part of the tape. Do test your paper to make sure that your paper doesn't tear. Some watercolour papers don't like masking tape. So I'm sponging the trees just using that Payne's grey, and as you can see it's a little bit darker, and I'm just sponging where I painted the trees before, so it's kind of like the underpainting. I'm using a natural sponge, but you could use a synthetic sponge, and I'm sponging wet on dry and pressing very gently so you get some nice textures, and try to vary the pattern as well, so change the angle of your wrist so you get sort of different sort of pattern and it doesn't look too symmetrical. And I'm going to allow my painting to dry. I'm using a small round brush and I'm painting in the tree trunks and branches wet on dry using a darker mix of that Payne's grey. So I'm gradually working sort of light mid-tones and dark tones. This is a really dark Payne's grey, and I'm painting that wet on dry in front of those trees with the size 2 brush, and I'm carefully removing the framing tape. You might want to use a hairdryer to sort of heat up the glue, and it makes it easier to remove it. And as you can see, I've got a lovely straight line there. What I'm doing now is I'm wetting the paper carefully with clean water using my flat 1-inch brush, and I'm painting the reflections damp into damp. As you can see there, it's not running too much. If it is running too much, just take the excess paint off on a paper towel. But I'm just sort of mirroring the actual tree trunks that I painted earlier. As you can see, it looks really effective as well. And I'm going to sponge a sort of dilute Payne's grey here, damp into damp, just in the water area, just to give the impression of the reflection of the foliage of those trees. I'm just going back into the trees and sponging wet on dry just to build up a few more darks and details there. And allow your painting to dry once more. What I'm doing now is I'm painting a branch that's sort of in the foreground, so it's quite dark, this colour, and I'm painting it wet on dry over the water area and over those trees in the sort of middle ground. So it creates the illusion of depth in your painting. Because the tonal value is darker, it comes forward and you can't see the tree trunks going through it. I've made it slightly thicker as well. So I'm just going to sort of build up the detail here. Take your time as well when you're painting tree trunks and branches. As you saw there, I just sort of did a couple of curvy lines, as I'm doing there, and then I join them up, and that's a way of creating and painting branches. It makes it so much easier and more natural looking. So make the branches thicker, and as you move on to the smaller branches, make them a little bit smaller, and as you go on to those little twigs, make them really small, and sort of as you get to the end of the twig, lift off with your brush so the line becomes thinner. When you press down with the brush hairs, the marks can be thicker. So as you lift off a little bit, take the pressure off the hairs, they'll become thinner. And it's a good one to practice this as well. It's a good skill to have in watercolour painting. But as you can see, just using one colour takes a lot of the pressure off, because you don't have to think about mixing colours. You can just concentrate on the techniques and building up light to dark, which is what we traditionally do in watercolour painting. What I'm doing now is I'm sort of painting leaves. If you notice, I'm sort of just barely touching the paper, or just sort of pressing down, then lifting off. I'm varying the size of the leaves as well, so having a couple smaller, some medium and some larger, and it just makes it look a little bit more realistic. So excuse my hand there, but I'm just painting some leaves at the top. And another tip, actually, I don't actually do it here, but you could actually turn your painting upside down to paint the leaves at the top and the twigs and branches. Sometimes it's hard to lean across a painting and keep your hand steady. So do turn it upside down, or even sideways as well. So this is just Payne's Grey and the size 2 brush. It's a round brush, and I'm just sort of painting some smaller leaves here, literally flicking the sort of brush there to create sort of different sort of marks and smaller leaves. What I'm doing now is I'm painting grasses in the foreground using a dark Payne's Grey, wet on dry. If you notice, because the paper is quite rough as well, you get a dry brush effect. You can see there's lovely texture in the grasses there, and texture comes forward because this is in the foreground. Again, it creates depth in your painting. Texture, darker tonal values, bigger marks, it all adds to the depth in your painting, brings things forward. So I'm just painting some details here. Details as well makes your paintings look more 3D. So I'm just using that size 2 brush, painting wet on dry, some sort of little wildflowers and sort of foliage just here on the water's edge in the foreground. Remember, keep it simple. You don't have to paint loads of detail. Remember, in watercolor, less is more. So what I'm going to do now to stop painting anymore, I'm going to spatter with a toothbrush. It is an old toothbrush, and I've loaded it with some medium sort of Payne's Grey paint, and as you see there, I'm actually rubbing my index finger along the hairs of the brush, and that spatters it. But you may want to practice this beforehand. So I am removing the framing tape now, which creates a really nice white border and gives me time to assess to see if I need to do any more to my painting, but I think I'll leave it there for now. So I really hope you found that tutorial helpful. This next tutorial, I take you through the process of painting a tree and working light to dark, and it's a really fun one to do. So let's have a look. I thought I'd take you through the drawing process. I'm using an HB pencil. As you see, I've just sketched in a horizon line there and a little bit of sort of markings of some fence posts. I'm now just sketching in the tree to the left here, just keeping it really, really simple, very sketchy indeed. It doesn't have to look exactly like the photograph, you know. Just by all means keep looking and keep sketching. Drawing accurately is all about looking and less about the marks you make on the paper, so keep looking all of the time and keep checking. The negative spaces are important here, so that gap between those trees, the one on the left to the right there, that lovely negative space is important as well. So maybe draw in that negative space separately, and you can actually gauge the distance between the trees. It works so well. That's I've continuing on sort of drawing the trees to the right here. It's really just about the trunks of the tree and then the outline of the canopy, you know, the whole shape of the sort of foliage, which is what I'm doing now, just going around with a sort of a wriggly pencil line there just to show the overall shape there, which is what I'm going to paint a very pale grey wash there. So that shape's important. I'm just sort of drawing a few little lines here for the hedgerow in front of the trees and also some of the grasses, not much in sort of the foreground there. What I am doing now, I suggest you do this with clean water. I've deliberately used very pale grey water so you can see what I'm doing. I'm sort of fully loaded my brush and I'm tapping the middle of the brush, holding the brush firmly, spattering this clean water onto the sort of canopy of the tree, but also in the hedgerow in front to help me paint this tree randomly. And I'm using rough watercolor paper to create more texture. So as you can see, when I'm applying the paint now, I can use the little gaps in between, catch those spots of water, and it all just looks a little bit more natural. I'm using a watered down Payne's Grey, but as you can see from my sketchbook demo of those different colours, there's lots of different varieties of darks that you can use. And I am working sort of a little bit wet on dry in places, but also where I've spattered with water, damp into damp as well. And I'm trying to leave some of those gaps that you can see on those winter trees, the spaces in between the branches and the foliage as well. And I'm really trying to create some lovely textures around the edges as well, just to kind of create that lovely crisp, frosty sort of effect on the branches. So I'm painting the hedgerow now with the same sort of watered down Payne's Grey, and in some areas using a dry brush brush technique, using, as you can see there, the belly of the brush as well, not just the tip, to create some texture on this rough watercolor paper, and also painting wet on dry, the sort of grasses, very pale washes in the foreground. Remember, in watercolor, less is more, so try not to paint every single individual grasses there. You'll just lose your white area and it won't look like a snowy winter scene, so you have to almost exaggerate the white and light here. I've mixed up a mid-tone of Payne's grey. What's great is you just have to worry about one colour and the tonal value. Still using the size 10 brush, I'm painting this damp into wet just to create a little bit of dark. I don't want to go too dark because this whole scene is so pale, and I thought it would be such a great challenge just to paint just one colour and try to create this snowy winter scene. I'm using the tip of my brush now as well just to paint the bottom of the sort of little hedgerow here covered in snow, and just trying to create some dark tonal values. I'm using just ordinary table salts and sprinkling it onto the damp surface here, so it's not too wet and it's not dried off, it's just in between, just like baby bear's porridge. And I'm sprinkling it as well on the grasses and on that little hedgerow there. And now I'm going to allow my painting to dry naturally. This is the painting dried off, and look at that lovely texture that the salt has created. It's created that illusion of a frosty look on those winter trees there. I'm swapped now to my size 6 brush, and as you can see, I'm using a much darker tonal value, so less water, more paint. It's the same colour, it's Payne's grey, and I'm just painting the tree trunks and then the branches, and I've diluted my brush as I go towards the top of the tree there to sort of create a paler look, so it looks like it's behind all that frostiness of the foliage and branches there. I've swapped now to my size 2 brush there to paint some of the thinner branches as well. I just find it a little bit easier. You may also find using a rigger or a liner brush easier to paint thin branches. Really take your time painting these winter trees. It can be very therapeutic. You can start off with a lighter tonal value if you want to, and then build to that darker tone to give you more confidence. I kind of went a little bit wrong here. I painted that tree trunk far too sort of wide, so I'm just wetting it here and lifted off a little bit with my paper towel as well, just to soften it back. in the back of my mind I thought I can actually sponge over with white paint to show sort of a lovely snowy effect later, so I knew that I would be okay there, but I wanted to soften it back a little bit. So never fear, there's always ways of getting around things. I'm just carrying on painting these sort of smaller branches and then wetting them with my brush, diluting, lifting off with the paper towel just to smudge them back a bit, to sort of make them look like they're hidden behind some of the foliage with the snow on the trees and the frost. And as I'm painting the smaller branches towards the edge there, I'm just paling off a little bit. The other thing you can do is turn your painting upside down. You may find it easier to paint some of these smaller branches. Just be patient when you're painting winter trees. Your hard work will pay off. Take your time. Remember, the trunks are thicker, the branches are thinner, and then those little twiggy bits are very thin and paler. And I'm also using my paper towel to dab off to create some light areas as well. So I'm just painting some wet on dry now, some sort of darker mid-tone grasses just in front of the trees there, just for a little bit of detail, keeping everything simple. Using my size 6 brush there, just painting in some posts there, making them smaller as they go towards the tree to create some depth. I'm, keeping it really nice and simple. I'm not actually copying the photograph so much, painting a little bit of wire there, and it just draws your eye into the focal point there. That's the trees on the right hand side, and I'm painting some grasses there with the tip of my brush, using that dark tone there, the Payne's grey, wet on dry with my size 2 brush, and just making little marks, not too much, not trying to slavishly copy the photograph, just using it to inspire me to paint this picture here. So remember, less is more, especially if you're starting out in watercolour. So this right hand side of the painting, which has a little bit more detail in the photograph, I decided to play it down a little bit. I felt if I'd painted this tree sort of in the distance on the right hand side, it would come forward too much and flatten the painting and take something away from these middle distant trees. So I've really just painted just a few marks. I'm using this size 2 brush just to paint some darker grasses now in the foreground. You saw I took off the excess fluid off my brush there just to make sure I have lots of control. Again, you will find that so helpful when you're starting out in watercolor painting. It's about controlling that sort of wet medium. I'm just painting some imaginary footprints here going towards the trees and spattering as well to create some textures. It also stops me from overworking my painting. So it's a good time to allow the painting to dry, and this is the final stage. So it's nice and simple this. I've got some white gouache, a little bit of cheating here, but it's just to paint some snow on the top of the post with my size 4 brush, wet on dry. I'm also also using a bit of dry brush. That's not very much water in the white gouache paint. You can use white watercolor or even white acrylic, but it's just to create some texture on the post there. It almost looks like the snow is stuck to the post. I'm doing the same here with the trees. I've got settled snow in between the branches there, but I'm also going to use that dry brush effect on the front of those tree trunks as well to create texture, and it really does give it that lovely wintry look as well. I'm using my paper towel to take off that excess moisture, so it makes sure I've got a lovely dry brush, and just combing that almost on top of that dark paint. The paint won't move because it is dry, but if you overwork it too much, you may disturb the paint underneath. Watercolor isn't permanent, so it's worth bearing that in mind, especially when you work in layers. You want to really carefully put that next layer on without sort of disturbing the paint underneath, because that's where you can end up with muddy watercolors. I'm just lightening up the foreground here, or the hedgerow here, with some more of the white gouache with the belly of my size 2 brush, almost a little bit of dry brush effect there. I watered down the white gouache slightly using the size 2 brush. You can see I just added a bit more water there. I'm just painting some white branches there. It's really quite nice to do over the Payne's grey, and also I'm going to apply some of that paint onto some of the branches, onto the outside edges, what I'm doing here, to look like the snow has fallen and settled on those branches. It can be quite effective. I'm using a scourer, just an ordinary household scourer. I'm dipping it into the slightly watered down gouache there. It's still slightly creamy, and I'm printing with this white gouache here, wet on dry, onto the top of the tree to create texture and also that frosty look on the trees there. It's so effective. You could have done this with some masking fluid right at the beginning, but I decided to use the white paint instead. I'm finishing off with a spatter. It always stops me from overworking my paintings. I've watered down the white gouache. As you can see, I'm holding it firmly in my hand towards the lower part of the brush and tapping the center of the brush. Really sort of tap it firmly. Try not to let the brush move. Don't let it sort of go up and down. Just hold it firmly in your hand and tap firmly, and keep loading as well. Make sure you protect other stuff around you as well. You don't end up getting anything with white spots all over it. And so here is the finished painting. I've kept it really nice and simple, really just 3 stages and just one colour, working light to dark. So all those traditional watercolour techniques with a little bit of salt and spattering and sponging thrown in. So I really hope you found that tutorial helpful. I'd just like to tell you a little bit about my Patreon membership. It supports the content that I create here on YouTube, but you can also get access to my outline sketches, and all of my tutorials are ad-free. They are extended tutorials and they have lots more voiceover. You can get access to my exclusive tutorials, and you can cancel anytime. Details about my membership can be found in the description below. Just click Patreon. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask me. Just put those in the comment section below. This next tutorial, again, I use one colour, Daniel Smith's Shadow Violet, one of my favourite colours. And I take you through a sort of a step-by-step landscape atmospheric scene with some beautiful wildflowers in the foreground. So it's a great way of creating depth in a painting. And I build up light to dark, practicing washes, working wet into wet and damp into wet. So let's take a look. I'm using Shadow Violet, Daniel Smith Shadow Violet, but you could use Payne's Grey, Black, or any dark grey colour that you like. I'm using a size 14 round brush and some rough watercolour paper, 300 grams, 14 by 10 inches. For details about all the materials I'm using, please check out the description below, and it'll have Amazon links if you'd like to purchase any of them. I load my brush each time I make this stroke going from left to right, going across. Make sure you have plenty of paint when you're doing a flat wash like this, wet on dry. This is for the background, and what I'm doing now is I've just diluted that wash and I'm paling it towards the horizon. So this is the sky area, and if you look at the reference photograph, it is very, very light. So don't worry about this, it's quite a nice stage. If you want to, and if it helps you, you can wet your paper to begin with. It's a nice way of loosening up a painting, especially if you're a bit scared about painting on it. For the outline drawing templates, check out the Patreon link in the top right hand corner. I'm working my way down now towards the bottom of the painting where it's quite sort of misty, and what I'm doing now is I'm adding plenty more water here to make sure I don't run out of paint. If you're worried about doing this, make sure you make a big puddle in the first place so you don't have to panic. And the other thing you can do is work on a smaller scale, especially if you're starting out in watercolor painting. What I'm doing now is I'm using the size 14 brush and mixing up a little bit more paint to make it a bit darker as you come into the foreground. Still wet on dry, and as you notice, I've got my little framing tape behind the painting there, tilting it because there's a slight angle so it helps the paint move down and flow better. And I've mixed up a little bit of slightly darker colour now, so the paint's a little bit damper, bit creamier, to make that darker area right in the foreground. Painting wet on dry. Now I've swapped to my size 6 brush, and I've got quite creamy paint, and I'm working on this wet paper, damp into wet. Remember, I'm just using one colour, shadow violet. What you might notice as I'm painting along here, the paint kind of separates and you get a pinky shade as well, which is really nice. But you do get that with other colours, other greys as well. They'll separate a little bit and there'll be like a secondary colour. So you've got all this control by using just one colour, but you've got this secondary colour as well as a bonus. So I'm just working away here on these sort of distant trees where it's quite misty in the background, and this is a nice way of creating mist. What you don't want to do is make your brush wetter than the surface of the paper, so make sure your paint's slightly creamier. In the foreground here, I've got hardly any sort of moisture on my brush. It's almost just the paint, and I'm using the surface of the paper that's damp to dilute the paint, and I'm painting some grasses in, damp into damp, with my size 14 brush. I've blow dried my painting, and I'm using the size 6 brush, and I'm working wet on dry, and I'm painting these wildflowers. I believe it's hogweed, but I could be wrong here. And I'm just diluting here, making some lighter areas, so dropping sort of a watery paint into a damp paint. You may get backgrounds, but it's all part of the lovely textures that you can get with watercolor. I've allowed my painting to dry again, and this is the next stage, and I'm building up tonal values. I'll be working wet on dry just to paint some darks now in this wildflower, and just to kind of give it a little bit more depth and bring this flower a little bit forward from the background as well. I'm using the size 6 brush. It is wet on dry. I'm still using that shadow violet, and I'm just creating textures on the edges here. Have fun with it. Just look at those darks in the picture. Remember, with watercolor, keep it simple. You know, just don't overdo things. Paint what you see and move on. Don't doubt yourself. Just finishing off there with the size 2 brush, I've decided to use, it's actually the end of my paintbrush, and I've sharpened it, believe it or not, with a pencil sharpener, so it creates a lovely point. Now this is not a sable brush, it's nothing special. This brush is an old brush that I've used to put masking fluid on, and I'm just creating some real spiky little textures just to finish off with those final little bits of details, wet on dry with that shadow violet. So for this next tutorial, I've got a little bit more of a complicated landscape scene, and in this tutorial I build up light to dark, use just one colour, and I've got some cosmos flowers in the foreground, so it's kind of painting flowers but also distant mountains to create depth in your painting. So it's got a little bit more detail, it's a little bit more complicated, so you've sort of learned the basics now, so I'm pushing you along a bit, and I really hope you're going to find it helpful. Let's take a look. Just to say, I'm actually masking out all of the cosmos flowers and a little bit of light in the water. I'm going to let that dry naturally. Once the masking fluid is dry, wet your sky area with some water. Make sure the water is clean, especially if you've done a little bit of colour mixing. I've mixed up a sort of milky wash of black, and I'm applying this now with the size 6 brush and painting wet in wet, leaving gaps for the clouds, and the clouds get smaller as they go towards the horizon, and the sky colour, in this case black, gets a little bit paler. What I'm doing now is I'm scrunching up some of the kitchen towel, or you can use tissue, and I'm lifting off some of the paint to create some more fluffy clouds, and it creates some hard edges as well. So you can do that. Sometimes I get a bit carried away with this, so see how you go. If your sky goes wrong, all you have to do is wet the paper again, wash it off and start again. What I'm doing now is, while that sky is drying, I've wet all the field area and I'm working wet into wet. Remember, I'm just using black, so it's all really nice and simple. I've left a little gaps here, a bit like how I've done with the clouds, to create some lighter areas. Because it's wet on wet, that will bleed in a little bit, and put a little slightly milkier colour now for the grasses at the top of this field, using my size 2 brush, just tapping away with slightly creamier paint to create that tonal value. Now I'm working damp into wet, so the surface is still wet, but my paint is creamier, and it creates more tonal value, and the paint doesn't move as much, so you get these fuzzy edges. And what I'm doing now, the paint is even creamier and the surface of the paper isn't as wet, so you get even darker tones as well. So I'm just basically making smaller marks in the distance and bigger marks as you come closer, and it creates depth because it makes those smaller marks look further away. And I'm just now again using very creamy paint. Don't be scared to do this, because it always dries lighter as well. Now here's my big marks using my size 14 brush in the foreground here, creating these marks for grasses and stems, etc. So the surface is damp and my brush is damp, so it's creamy. And so I've got lots of tonal value here. I've got the light, the medium and the dark tones, and you get this using the damp into damp, wet into wet technique. I'm using the size 2 brush now to create some grasses, using thin creamy paint, damp into damp. Working a little bit on the background hills here. Now make sure when you do this that your sky is dry, or it's nearly touched, it's touch dry, so that that paint doesn't bleed. As you can see, I've got a nice hard edge there, so it's safe. I haven't actually blow dried my painting yet, because I'm waiting for the foreground to dry off a little bit so I can scratch out some grasses with my plastic card. Here what I'm doing with my size 6 brushes, I'm just putting some darker tones at the peak of those mountains, but also a little bit more in the foreground just behind that cosmos flower, and I'm working damp into wet. So you've got that. So I just want to have those peaks looking a bit darker at the top. It's quite a nice effective technique, and I'm just softening the edge there with my damp brush. So here I am scraping off those grasses. So you don't want the paint too wet, because it all just goes back on itself. You want it damp and almost so that the shine's going before you lift off. And now I'm sprinkling just ordinary table salt onto the damp surface, and I'm going to let that dry naturally, so don't blow dry, because you want that magical effect of the salt to work. And here we are, the salt has worked. Hurrah, I say to myself. I'm always pleased when my salt's worked. So everything is dry now, and I'm just painting now that next little bit of mountain, so leaving the background ones dry alone, and I'm just painting this next sort of layer wet on dry. So with wet on dry you get nice crisp hard edges, and as you can see, it pulls away from those distant mountains. I've made a slightly darker colour for this particular mountain right in the middle. I just want to really, if you look at the reference photograph, I want to make it nice and dark at the top. Remember, this is wet on dry. I'm using my size 6 brush, and I'm very, very carefully just sort of really finessing this edge. I've just added some more paint to my brush. Don't have your brush too dry, really heavily load it, because sometimes the paint dries quickly onto the paper and it will leave you with a hard edge, and you don't want that. So make sure you really load your brush. And what I've done there is I've rinsed my brush, and with the water on the brush, I've wiped the excess on the side. I'm pushing that sort of wettish brush upwards towards that dark area. Don't pull the paint down, push it up, because you get that light area below it. And the painting has dried now. I've given it a good blow dry, and I'm painting that next layer of mountains, the one in the foreground. And what this does, if you look at those other 2 layers now that I've previously painted, I'm really creating depth, not just with tonal value, but also using the edge, the hard edge that watercolor painting has when you paint paint wet on dry. So it's a really good, useful technique. I'm using the same technique as I did previously. I've painted that dark on, wet my brush, and I'm pushing a little bit of water up towards that dark, so you get that sort of misty effect just below it. It's a really good way of painting mist and soft areas as well. And now I'm just diluting now, coming down to the sort of middle ground. So I'm going to let that bit dry off a little bit there, and I'm working on the left hand side now with my size 6 brush. Now the consistency of the paint's slightly creamier now because I'm building up tonal values. It's quite dark, this area in the photograph, and the reason why I want to exaggerate that darkness is because it's light against dark with that light on the water. So it's all these compositional things I'm doing here to really get your painting to look good and create depth, and the light's so important. So I'm still using this size 6 brush. Now this side is still damp. As you can see, the paint's fuzzy and it's drifting up. Don't worry about that. The paint here is very creamy because I want to create sort of like the tops of trees sort of running up. So I'm using the technique of damp into damp to do that. So, you know, just take your time in these areas. And if your painting dries a little bit, just use a little spritzer bottle and just give it a little spritz just to soften everything and wet everything. But don't create big puddles, just a little misty spray. And I'm just finessing now the edges here, just to, again, looking at the reference photograph to inspire me. And I'm just painting this central part of darks here. Now it's important to get these darks in because this is going to make your cosmos flowers really stand out because they're light. So this is dark against light, really important. Now look at this, the painting has dried and look how much lighter it's dried. It's amazing. That's why you've got to go for it sometimes. So what I'm doing now is I'm taking off my masking fluid. Now that's why it's so important for your painting to be dry, not even damp. You must blow dry or leave it for a couple of hours, because if you try to attempt to take off masking fluid, you could tear your paper or smudge your painting. So that's a really important tip. What I'm doing now, masking fluid removed, I'm also taking off the salt with my kitchen towel. Everything's off now, everything's been taken off. Now I can paint these beautiful cosmos flowers. Take your time with this. It's wet on dry, and I'm using the size 6 brush, and I'm painting the back of the flower and the sort of the detail going into the flower, and I will be painting the stem as well. And I'm using, you know, sort of quite a creamy sort of wash. It's quite dark. If you compare it, it's probably as dark as that right hand mountain was when I painted it previously. Remember to really take your time, load your brush, use that tip to get the detail, and remember to breathe, because I sometimes forget to breathe, and I realise that, because especially when it's something very detailed. So take your time with the stem, just sort of rub it down a little bit. Don't try and do it all in one go, because sometimes it can just go, you can go off piste, as it were. So really take your time. I'm sort of just edging my way down. It is quite dark. It really comes away from the foreground. So just, you know, try and be as brave as you can. I've watered down the colour, so it's a very softer tone on some of these petals here. And what I really liked about this photograph is the kind of way you can paint the cosmos. It's a really nice, easy way. It's wet on dry, and then you do a little bit of softening of edges here and there, but it's not too fussy. I really like it, and I love the way it just pops away from the background. It's so effective. So you can work your way around these petals, painting wet on dry, and then rinsing your brush, taking the excess liquid off on the side, and then softening as you go. So I've blow dried the painting, and I'm putting on the next sort of layer of tones and details. I call this stage of the painting darks and details, because it reminds me not to overpaint, not to overdo it, not to get things muddy. Now if you find it tricky painting stems, I would suggest maybe turning your painting upside down. It's the same when you're painting sort of branches in trees as well. You may find it easier, just that access, you know, the way, you know, your hand might feel freer. So I'm just painting this upside down, and it helps me anyway. So I'm just giving final little dark accents to the back of these flowers using creamier paint, and I'm using my size 2 brush. I don't know about you, but I really enjoy just using one colour because it just takes away all the pressure of colour mixing. You can just get on with the painting. The background is dry. I'm painting wet on dry. I'm using the size 6 brush. I'm just putting some smaller marks in just here and there, and I'm putting a little bit more dark on that water's edge because, as I said earlier, when it dried a lot paler. So when it does that, you can just go over another layer. So it's another layer of watercolour painting, and I'm just softening and I'm just working my way around that flower as well, just to bring that flower out as well. And the paint I'm putting right on that water's edge is creamier, so it really pops that out, and it really sort of makes that water look really light as well. And I'm just cutting into the flower here, so you can really take your time with these details. Don't feel rushed, just enjoy it, enjoy the process rather than thinking about the finishing line. I think that's partly, when I was painting for years, that's one thing I found, was that worrying about the end and forgetting about that middle bit, which is the most important bit. Be present in your painting. So I'm just working now again on this middle bit here, because this is a really important bit, because this brings out those light flowers. So I'm still using the size 6 brush, and it's sort of a medium to dark tone of paint. I'm just tidying up here because it looked a bit complicated what I was doing with the flowers there. So just sort of finessing that a little bit and working wet on dry with this size 6 brush, going towards the right hand side. So really bringing out that water's edge, but also working on creating some more trees and things like that on that far side of the shore. Now this is something you can do, you don't have to, but I thought if some of you have had a few little hiccups with the your little cosmos flowers, which I did have one in this one in the middle here, I kept quiet about it if you notice. I'm just sort of tidying it up with some white gouache. You can use white watercolour paint, but it's a little bit more transparent, so you might need to use a couple of layers. I'm just tidying up this one on the right as well. No one's going to know. It just all works well, and you're not cheating. It's still a water-based medium. Now, you know I love to spatter, so I'm spattering this white. You don't have to do it, but it's my process, and I just think they look like little tiny little cosmos flowers or other white wild flowers. And I thought I'd spatter some of the black. Again, you don't have to do this, and I'm using my hand now because I've just realised I might spatter over my white flowers. So do think about that. You don't have to do it, but at least you've seen me do it, so you can decide. Here's the finished painting. I've taken away the framing tape, so you can see this nice white border. It gives me time to assess to see if I need to do any more, but I think I'll leave it there for now. This last tutorial, it's all about creating your own style in a way. I tried to encourage that. Still using one colour, Daniel Smith's Moonglow, the most amazing colour. And I take you through a step-by-step atmospheric sort of seascape scene using lots of experimental techniques, tilting and spritzing. I also use the plastic card to create the look of rocks as well. I think you're going to really enjoy it. And what I really encourage you is to kind of work a little bit from maybe a reference photograph, but certainly from your imagination, practicing sort of different techniques and developing your own style. And this tutorial is perfect for that. Let's take a look. You can use any sort of dark colour, Payne's grey, black, etc. It's a very simple seascape here. I've already started. I'm using hot press paper, my spritzer bottle, and I've sort of painted the sort of mountains in sort of one sort of shape there, some distant mountains and even a little bit of water. But I'm actually using the mountain colour, the Moonglow, with the spritzer bottle, tilting my paper so it runs into the sky wet in wet. Make sure you've got plenty of paper towels or old rags to mop up the excess paint. I'm wetting the sky area now using just one brush, my size 10 black velvet round brush. I use it all the time. It's my go-to brush, and I've mixed up a little bit of the Moonglow there, painting top left hand corner, wet into wet, tilting, trying to get as much atmosphere as I can here. And I'm spritzing now with my spritzer bottle all over that there to sort of dilute the paint, create some happy accidents, and just keep tilting and just see what happens. I'm just mopping up there so that doesn't run back into the painting, and I'm actually now drizzling water into this sky with my brush as well, and painting a really pale wash going towards the horizon, wet into wet, pulling some of that mountain colour into the sky as well. I'm now painting the sea here using the moon glow, and just leave lots of light as well. It's so important to have light in your painting. I've actually got some dark paint there as well, so I've got a lovely contrast of dark and light. I'm wetting this beach area with my size 10 brush. I'm mixing up a puddle of the moon glow colour, spritzing the foreground there. You can wet it with your brush, but I've decided to use my spritzer bottle. Try to keep away from your mountains and sky area, or you could wait for them to dry off. And I'm painting this now wet into wet, trying to keep a lot of light between the sea, the sort of shoreline there, and I'm tilting again using the tip of the brush to create a little bit of texture and marks in the beach area. I'm just going to sprinkle a little bit of table salt in the foreground, left and right. This will absorb some of the paint and create some amazing textures and lights. I'm using a plastic card. It's just a plastic card cut up, store card. I'm painting using creamy paint onto this damp surface here, some of these rocks to the right hand side, almost sculpting them with my card, you know, sort of going around, seeing the sort of different marks and shapes I can get, and then swiping off at the bottom there where I've got some paint across the shoreline to create a lovely dark edge and a light beach area. I'm actually painting in these rocks here with the card, really being bold with my marks. It's on a damp surface, just using that moon glow colour, quite thick and creamy with the card. It's so freeing up to use a card to apply paint and just using one brush and one colour. And in watercolour, this is where the less is more. There's less materials here. I'm just using one colour with some simple techniques, applying the paint with the plastic card and building up light to dark. The best way to improve your watercolours is to tell yourself less is more. Try not to overwork your paintings. Don't try to perfect them. It really will help improve your watercolour painting. You could leave your painting to dry like that, or you could spritz a little bit more to create more drama, more abstraction and more atmosphere. It creates a lot of light as well. While the painting dried off a bit, it's time now to lift off some of the rocks there using my plastic card. Make sure the paint's not too wet, otherwise it will all run back on itself. But it creates a little bit of light. Look at that. It really does create lots of texture and details. And look at the salt as well. You probably can't pick this up on the video, but as the salt's lifted off and created these lovely light textures, there's almost a bluey tinge. I think that's the moon glow that does that. It's such a versatile colour. You've got this dark violet, pink, and almost a sort of a pale blue as well. I've lifted off a little bit more paint, as you saw there. I've allowed the painting to dry, and I'm just masking out the the whole painting except for these little rock area where the waves are splashing up against those rocks there. I'm using white gouache. You could use white acrylic, white watercolor, or white acrylic ink. I'm using my still one brush, the size 10 brush, to spatter some of the white on the rocks, and I've decided to discard the paper towel and just spatter a little bit here and there to create some atmospheres. Where the little spatter, the white went, I'm just softening here and there as well, so you can lift off if you don't like where it's spattered. I've decided to paint a few birds in the sky to create a bit of life. I usually paint one large, medium and small towards the horizon, and I've still using the size 10 brush with the Moonglow paint. I'm removing the washi tape now. Love this tape. It doesn't seem to tear the paper, thank goodness, and it reveals a lovely white border. And here is the finished painting. I'm really pleased with it. It looks so atmospheric, and I've just used one brush and one colour. Really hope you found this tutorial inspiring and helpful in developing your own style using lots of these experimental techniques. So I really hope you found this tutorial helpful, putting together these 6 tutorials, building up from a beginner and pushing yourself to learn more and gain confidence in watercolour. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments section below. If you would like to support the content that I create here on YouTube, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? You will get access to outlined sketches and extended tutorials, but also my exclusive tutorials, and you can cancel anytime. Details about the membership can be found in the description below. Just click Patreon. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.